Hello, and welcome back to Parley. This prompt was written by EyePatchNotes. Hope you'll enjoy listening. It's about speed, as we're going to define it, in tabletop role-playing game build systems. The idea is that a lot of these games, well, being a tabletop role-playing game, they don't have live-action, real-time combat. They're turn-based games, and thus they have some kind of amount of actions you can do in your turn. You know, a mix of movement and maybe a few different types of actions that are different values or speeds, you could even call them. A bonus action, maybe the flavor is this is something you can do quickly, and so that's why you can do it while also committing an action, like attacking or something, during your turn. There is a key aspect of a lot of these games' build systems, player option systems, where you can make an action cost a different thing. You know, something that was an action, maybe now you can do as a bonus action. Maybe something that would have been a bonus action, now you can do as part of your movement, or at the expense of some of your movement, or whatever. Maybe you find something you could do as part of your movement, and you give it further ability to, I don't know, affect your action and bonus action. You make it more valuable. That most of the concepts we're going to talk about in this are going to be about that concept of speed. Can you speed up the time in which your character can execute all the things that kind of set up their damage combo or the rotation they want to do? And you could also refer to that thing I said at the end, like you can make your movement more valuable in some way, as increasing the, I imagine it's, you said somewhere, you just said value basically, or like improving the economy, I guess, of the actions you have, making the things you have more valuable, not necessarily making something cost a less valuable part of your turn. That's the topic. This applies to a lot of tabletop role-playing games. We're mostly going to talk about Pathfinder. Most of this will be easily transferable to Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition as well. EyePatchNotes begins. I'm increasingly convinced that Chapter 5 of this long Pathfinder discussion parlay series should be feat, economy, and value, since feats are deeply intertwined with the action system in Pathfinder. It's true, up until now, most of the ways, EyePatchNotes, you've told me, there are ways to speed up a character's, actions or improve their action economy or the value of their actions have been feats. In Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, this is a comparatively smaller aspect of your build. You do get to pick a few feats, but they generally are not where you can kind of make something faster, as we've defined it here. While I was retooling this particular parlay, my muse bequeathed to me a ticket graphic, as opposed to the bucket from last time. Bucket's pictured here, and then obviously here's the ticket. The mental model of handing in a whole ticket to exchange your whole round, for some action, or tearing it into smaller pieces to spend your action here, your movement here, whatever, may click better for some people. Yeah, big fan of the idea of giving people multiple ways to understand the metaphor. The jury's out on how to represent bonus actions and reactions using a ticket, but whatever. For the summary this time, feats and class features primarily focus on improving action economy or value. Different classes focus on speeding up certain different actions. Players can leverage various options to apply effects or debuffs in the desired order, and speeding those things up or changing their action economy may help execute them in the order desired. And to emphasize, feats and class features used this way can fit several turns worth of actions into one turn. And to elaborate on that, per a bit of the captain's vocalization, yes, I requested some real-world applications of action economy in future parlays. Thank you, EyePatchNotes. I'm looking forward to them. There is some Pathfinder legalese to navigate, but I'm hoping slices of builds sell the richness of the system more than abstract discussions. It should also be said that Pathfinder's bonus actions and reactions have no default functionality. You can't do anything with them until you get a feature that lets you. A player must find something to do with those actions, or they are leaving power on the table. Many classes and spells fill in these time slots naturally, but it is not a given. It's not like there's not very many ways to fill them, but you do have to pick a way to fill them, or they go unfilled. Going back to the Mad Dog Roguebarian build from a previous EyePatchNotes parlay, the Mad Dog subclass for Barbarians is one of the most egregious action economy boosters I can think of, which is a bit telling or damning to me given my information retention. This is a topic for next-ish parlay, but mentioning it now, the Ferocious Fetch feature. At 5th level, a Mad Dog's War Beast gains improved drag as a bonus feat. animal companions have limited feats, normally the Mad Dog subclass adds this feat directly to their companion in addition to everything else it does. And the other thing this does is that as a swift action, or a bonus action in D&D, a Mad Dog can command her Warbeast to move toward an opponent within 6 tiles by default, and attempt a drag combat maneuver to pull the target back toward the Mad Dog. The Warbeast can move before and after performing the maneuver, but this movement counts toward the Warbeast's total movement during its turn. A couple of things to break down. So first of all, that thing about the Warbeast being able to move before and after the maneuver, but that counts toward their movement. If you've played 5th edition D&D, you can already split move, so that might sound like what's going on there. In Pathfinder, I believe you cannot split move, and so that's part of what this is. This drag action thing that the Mad Dog Barbarian can command their Warbeast to do allows them to split move, and lets the Warbeast do a drag combat maneuver, attempt a drag combat maneuver, a grapple, and then drag. As the Barbarian's bonus action, I believe is what's happening here. Leaving the Warbeast itself with their entire turn. They get improved drag as a bonus feat, but they can be made to use it using none of their own action economy and only the Barbarian Master's bonus action. That is to say, the Rogue Barbarian spends only a bonus action themselves to make the companion approach a target, normally their full movement for the turn since you can't split move, make the companion attempt a drag maneuver, this is like a grapple and so normally a full action, and bring the target closer to the party if they succeed, which would take multiple turns of movement normally. And this is before EyePatchNotes, my personal edition of the reverse somersault throw feat, which artificially adds 3 tiles to the drag maneuver and knocks the target prone, total of 9 tiles dragged. What would equate to the companion's full turn, a full ticket-sized action, their movement and action for the turn, is now a non-full turn cost during the Rogue Barbarian's turn. And finally, Ferocious Fetch is not a spell and does not consume resources. The player can use Ferocious Fetch as much as they like. Really good. Oh, and the companion is still allowed their full suite of actions, albeit while prone along with their target. I would like to go back to the Rogue Barbarian prop and do the Rogue Barbarian proper justice one day. For now, they will have to piggyback off of the arguably more interesting and nuanced Witch of Contradictions Parley. Both characters are highly cherished members of my martial roster, and I put them in the same party for MMORPG-like reasons. More on this eventually. I would like to hear more about that eventually, but we'll put a pin in it for now. The idea of a squad, or kind of the canon of characters that you've built as somebody who likes making builds, is a concept that's very rooted in my mind too. There are a couple of builds that have stuck with me over the years, so the experience of playing them is very familiar or comfortable to me. So I resonate a lot with that idea, but we'll have to hear about it in the future. Yep. To the body of the parlay then. Oversimplifying the player decisions in Pathfinder, every feat or class feature accomplishes at least one of the following goals. Remove or reduce a penalty, like weapon proficiency. You get weapon proficiency. Numerically improving an existing action or introducing a new action, or speeding up an existing action, as we talked about it before. Just to clarify the difference between numerically improving an existing action and speeding up an existing action, we're talking about making the action you perform to do an attack do more damage versus making that action be a bonus action. Going on a slight side venture, as we'll be oscillating between those latter two, numerically improving and speeding up an action in this parlay. One of Pathfinder's core pillars is granting feats every odd level. Contrasted with D&D, maybe granting a feat every 4 levels in a particular class, and only if you do a lot of levels in one class, Pathfinder allows the player to rely on class choices for base functionality, spells, martial ability, and their feat choices for whatever they want, really. This abundance of player agency comes to a head when several Pathfinder classes also tend to come with bonus feat-like abilities every even level. Fighters are the classic example, granting the universal feat slots at 1st level, 3rd level, etc., and combat feats from their fighter levels at 2nd, 4th, and so on. So they can pick feats every level, but some of those levels, the fighter levels, it has to be a combat feat. Barbarians get what are called rage powers at every even level, 2nd, 4th, and onward. In some ways, rage powers are more powerful than feats because they're class exclusive by default, so they got some additional power budget. The Intimidating Glare rage power allows the character to apply light fear to one target by rolling Intimidate as a move type action. Light fear imposes a -2 penalty on attack rolls, saves, and a few other things. All characters can roll Intimidate as a standard type D, or their action for the turn, but barbarians who take Intimidating Glare as part of their class progression can keep their standard action free. They're doing it as a part of their movement. Interesting. Now for some weeds. What does freeing the barbarian's standard action accomplish? First is that by performing attacks at all, you normally spend a standard action or a full round action. By using a class feature to intimidate as a movement action or part of your movement, the barbarian can intimidate and attack in the same turn. More importantly for this parlay, the barbarian can intimidate first, and their attack is resolved against a target under a fear effect. Consider the following text blocks. The Hurtful combat feat. When you successfully demoralize an opponent within your melee reach with an intimidation check, you can make a single melee attack against that creature as a bonus action. While raging, the barbarian can do an intimidate check from the Intimidating Glare power, and the Cruel weapon enchantment lets the wielder strike a creature with that weapon when under a fear effect and make them sickened for 1 round. So a barbarian that takes Intimidating Glare, the Hurtful feat, and a Cruel enhanced weapon can perform this series of actions. Move action to approach distant enemy or Intimidating Glare an enemy they're already close to. Standard action to intimidate or attack the enemy, and then a bonus action to strike an intimidated target. Most characters would have to pick between moving, attacking, and intimidating, but using this Hurtful engine, type bonus, movement, and standard actions in tandem, the barbarian can match a 6-level full attack, 2 attacks as a full round action. Or the barbarian can still attack once as a bonus action, despite moving and intimidating the enemy as their movement and full round or standard actions. This is hard to describe. I'll summarize in a second. This action economy would not fall off until 11th level, where they could do a full attack and get 3 attacks, but even then this character is compressing 2 debuffs into 1 turn. Indeed, the 2 different patterns of attack we described here are that you're already close to an enemy, you intimidate them as your movement since you don't need it to move closer. You attack them with your action, which inflicts sickened if you hit them because they're intimidated and you have the Cruel weapon, and then you just get the bonus action attack as well. Or you can move to close the distance, intimidate them as your action for the round, and then attack them with a bonus action. They're intimidated, and so you still sicken them as well. And thus you inflict 2 debuffs. Whether you need to move in close or not, you get an extra attack if you are already close. Pretty good. And you get that all using what would be, just your full turn to attack twice. You get to attack once or twice still, and you inflict 2 debuffs at the same time. It's also pretty flexible. If you had to move to catch up, then you'd only get 1 attack normally. Cool. This is where some amount of the charting is helpful as well, though a lot of this chart in my mind is just the visual anchor of having a ticket with your movement and your standard action on it. But here at the bottom, you can see the flow of being able to improve your action economy using these features we talked about. Normally, intimidating them would take a standard action, most of your full turn, but you can now do it as a movement action, which, just a minor gripe, that on the ticket, those are the same size, but I think your movement, it's fair to say, is often less valuable than your standard action. And then making that single attack normally would have been a standard action, but it can now be a bonus action provided that the target is demoralized with Intimidate. You can see, because of the way EyePatchNotes has lined them up too, we've moved the demoralization and the attacking off of your standard action, allowing that to be used to flex. You can do an extra attack if you have your standard action free, or if you need to do the fear part because you needed your movement, you can now use your standard action for that. Because we freed up the option to do the demoralization and the attack with things other than our standard action, but we could still do them with the standard action. The build now has the flexibility to do a couple different rotations and do its thing, regardless of whether the enemy needs to be moved closer to or not, which is very valuable. A lot of builds don't do this. They have a very powerful thing you can do, but they only do it if the stars align, and so The thing I like about this as a concept is not only that you've demonstrated the benefit of speeding these things up directly, which is that you can do a sequence of actions in one turn that you normally wouldn't be able to, but you've also demonstrated the thing that can make these things fun to play, which is that your concept or power fantasy for the character can now be executed in a more flexible way. You didn't just speed up your action economy or your actions. You made it so that they can be several things. You made them more flexible, and thus they can adapt to the situation and you can kind of still do your thing. I'll say that my opinion is that Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition is not very good at this, so I'm envious and excited by the concept of builds that did this kind of thing. Here on the side we can see a few examples of, I think these are just levels of debilitation condition that you have set aside, and some of these we'll come back to later. Inconveniences, impairments, and then being incapacitated. And light fear here, what we're doing when we demoralize with the intimidate, that can now be a standard action or movement, is reducing their saves, accuracy, and more by -2. They can still do what they're doing normally, it's just a debuff. Sickened is -2 on accuracy, saves, and more, but they stack, right? Yes, and so the benefit here is that while they can still act mostly as normal, every time you do one of these things, you intimidate them or you sicken them, you're making them easier and easier to fight, while still getting to attack them. Cool. Elaborating on the Intimidate engine, the actual name of Light Fear condition is Shaken in Pathfinder. I used Light Fear as it is more explicit about what category the condition falls under. Many classes and feats support a fear-based style of play, and thus it is possible to leave hanging synergies for the table to take advantage of. Any character can opt for a cruel weapon, even if they're not the one causing the fear effect. It sounds like the main thing what you're saying is there's enough sources of fear-type effects in Pathfinder that you don't necessarily need to enable the fear yourself. Obviously, it's still nice if the party has a source of it. Cool. Likewise, intimidating an enemy using a martial character reduces the target's save for an allied spellcaster. Witches with the evil eye hex have a choice when applying the -2 or -4 penalty. They can set up their next turn or help an ally with theirs. We here have a summary of how you demoralize as well, a basic use of the Intimidate skill. You can use Intimidate to cause an opponent to become shaken for a number of rounds, using the Demoralize action. The DC of this check is equal to 10 plus the target's hit dice plus the target's wisdom modifier. So you have to roll your intimidation check, a d20 plus, your intimidation bonus, over whatever 10 plus the target's hit die size, I guess, plus the target's wisdom modifier is. If you're successful, the target is shaken for 1 round. This duration increases by 1 round for every 5 by which you beat the DC. You can only threaten an opponent this way if it is within 30 feet and can clearly see and hear you. Using Demoralize on the same creature only extends the duration. It doesn't create a stronger fear condition. Demoralizing an opponent is normally, we've established, a standard, action. The Shaken condition. A Shaken character is -2 to attack rolls, saving throws, skill checks, and ability checks, a less severe state of fear than frightened or panicked, and the Sickened condition gives them -2 to all attack rolls, weapon damage rolls, that's a difference from Shaken, saving throws, skill checks, and ability checks. Sickened also applies a -2 penalty to damage, otherwise it's exactly the same thing as Shaken, but they stack. For the Witch of Contradiction herself, the build we'll talk about for the latter half of the parlay, she is a dedicated Eldritch Guardian Fighter chassis. This means that both she and her Bat familiar will have a high martial score with which to strike accurately and learn feats. However, as much as Hex Strike helps the Witch's action economy, the Bat does not have true unarmed strikes or hexes to apply. I am in fact greedy enough to want the action economy booster that affects both the Witch and her mount. Yes, it's time to tackle the monster that is mounted combat, soon TM. We'll have to leave that for a little later because we're moving on to how the Witch of Contradiction build is going to use this concept. But as a quick summary, we've given an elaborate example of how the Rogue Varian build, discussed in a previous parlay, is using this concept of speeding up your action economy to execute a series of actions that normally wouldn't fit into 1 round. How you can use the Mad Dog Rogue Varian is doing something different, and then there's that Fear engine. Two examples then of how you can speed your action economy up to execute a series of actions that normally wouldn't fit into one round. There we go. And this concept we're now going to apply to other builds. I'll have to say, EyePatchNotes, kind of a question with these Parley I sometimes have is, why are you making these? And I think one reason we've talked about is you want to demonstrate to me and to the audience what you see as the merits of Pathfinder as a build system. I think this is a compelling way to do that. You've set up simple examples of what the system is capable of allowing you to do, and now you're showing us that they are relatively universal. In what ways do these things interlock? And can you use them on a wide variety of powerful builds? I will take your word for it that the examples we're discussing here are absolutely not like corner case, this is all there is. Yeah, there's lots of places in the system where you can do this, I would imagine. And one reason, one cue for me that is the case, is that you seem to be using relatively straightforward features just combined in ways that are minded to improve action economy in a powerful way. It's how you're using them, not that these are like not relatively straightforward features of the game. And thus, I have faith that you could make lots more builds using this methodology. I just have found that compelling so far. So anyway, the second example then. Witches, in addition to being intelligence-based, I am addicted to intelligence-based casters, but in addition to being intelligence-based full casters with a familiar, also enjoy an every even level toolbox. Hexes. Sounds like a lot of classes are going to do that, aren't they? Popular examples include the show-stopping debuffs Slumber and Ice Tomb, as well as the more mild Evil Eye. Most debuff hexes have a once per creature clause, rather than times per day clauses. These hexes are practically always online for new combat encounters, so you can only use them once on a creature ever? Or for a little while, but you can use them as often as you want, just not twice on the same creature. Interesting, that seems very powerful, yeah, as long as you're winning the fights. Hexes that impair enemy action economy are regarded quite highly by the community, and for good reason. A debilitated enemy is a dead enemy with few extra letters. D-E-A-D, dead. If they're ice-tombed, whatever that is. Hexes frequently compete with the standard action that spells ask for, but do not consume any spell slots or resources once learned. Ergo, a witch can use hexes to supplement their actual spell list, since they learn hexes for free as part of normal progression. Yeah, you could weave a spell slot here, a hex there, and be doing about action-valued actions every turn without using a spell slot every turn. Cool, you could mix them together that way. You can already think of how debuffs that combo to set up further damage would be pretty nice, right? Like, let's say hexes are overall a little weaker than spells. I don't know that they are, but let's just say they are. They're mostly debuffing, and they don't often do too much damage. Let's just say that's true. I don't know if it is. And thus, you can maybe find ways where a spell will do more damage to a frostbitten enemy, and then use, again, whatever Ice Tomb is, I'm very attached to that now, to apply that condition and then follow up with damage, thus converting your hex, which saved you some spell slots, you're only using a spell slot every couple of actions, into basically damage by debuffing the enemy in a way that your spell will then convert into more damage for you. Pretty cool. Seems valuable. Anyway, true stun-like effects will target Constitution and Wisdom saves, which are demonstrably higher across the board. Slumber and Ice Tomb will lose their crowd control when saved against. Evil Eye is a little more interesting, though. Unlike most spells that are wholly negated on a successful enemy save, Evil Eye has a minimum duration of 1 round. Because Evil Eye consumes no spell slots and is available once per creature, the player can always count on the debuff landing in some capacity. Like the intimidating Glare Barbarian, there are a few ways to supplement a witch-specific action economy. Cackle is a witch hex feature. A witch can cackle madly as a move-type action. This is sounding familiar. Any creature that is within 30 feet that is under the effects of an Agony Hex, Charm Hex, Evil Eye Hex, Fortune Hex, or Misfortune Hex caused by the witch has the duration of that hex extended by 1 round. The creature must be able to hear the witch to be affected by the cackle. Evil Eye is a witch hex that causes doubt to creep into the mind of a foe within 30 feet that she can see as a standard action. The target takes a -2 penalty on one of the following: AC, ability checks, attack rolls, saving throws, or skill checks, the witch's choice. The hex lasts for a number of rounds equal to 3, plus the witch's intelligence modifier. A successful wisdom save reduces this to just 1 round. This is a mind-altering effect. At 8th level, the penalty increases to -4. And Hex Strike, a combat feat. When you gain this feat, choose one hex that you can use to affect no more than one opponent. If you make a successful unarmed strike against an opponent, in addition to dealing your unarmed strike damage, you can use a bonus action to deliver the effects of the chosen hex to that opponent. I see where this is going. Putting aside the challenges of asking a witch to engage in fisticuffs, provided you're willing to punch the enemy, we have this sample turn flow. A standard action to perform an unarmed strike, a bonus action to attempt Evil Eye or another hex, and a move type action to cackle. And because Evil Eye has 1 round duration, regardless of whether it succeeds, and cackle extends that duration by 1 round, you are guaranteed 2 rounds of Evil Eye hex. Similar to the Barbarian, jumping through these hoops allows the witch to 1. Deal damage as part of a non-damage rotation, where you're trying to debuff them, but you still get to do damage, and 2. Deal damage before attempting a hex. And this is notable because the Witch of Contradiction does not use any of these feats or hexes, except Cackle. Blood hexes, part of a Damned by the Community publication, can only be applied upon enemies recently damaged by the character. In order to apply blood hexes in 1 turn rather than 2 turns, arguably making them viable at all, the player must engage in alternative or class-specific turn economies. In my notes, I said we weren't going to talk about blood hexes, but I think I was just going to talk about them briefly, and we should talk about them more, because that is where this gets a little exciting. After all, the Evil Eye cackle situation you have in this example, while it's certainly effective, as you point out, it's not really necessary. You could just set it up on its own turn and have it last like 1 or 2 rounds. You could just Evil Eye as a normal action and then use Cackle and have a minimum of 2 rounds. You could do that. It's better to fit in like an attack as part of it, and you have Hex Strike to do it as a bonus action while still fitting an attack in. It's better, but I mean, it's not hugely important to do that. It sounds like the real benefit is with blood hexes. So let's talk about blood hexes a little bit. This is a really weird piece of design. Maybe we'll talk about that later. Let's establish what they are first. I'm going to read the rules text after I read EyePatchNotes kind of apology for them being a weird piece of design. Covering my bases a bit, EyePatchNotes says, blood hexes are a theoretically class-agnostic feat type that shares an opportunity cost with normal witch hexes. If a witch could learn a new hex from normal progression, they can take a blood hex as a bonus feat instead. However, blood hexes literally function differently if the character has witch levels at all, so these feats are not really class agnostic. We can go over the specifics another juncture, but they are bad. Blood hexes also lack the combat tag and would not be passed over via the Eldritch Guardian's feat inheritance. Blood hexes take many forms, but all obey some basic rules that apply to each blood hex feat. Blood hexes are available to any character who meets the feat prerequisites. Blood hex feats work only against targets you have dealt hit point damage to recently, put a pin in it, with the exact time frame and any requirements for how you deal the damage outlined in each feat. Oh well, okay. The saving throw DC of a blood hex is always equal to 10 plus half your character level, plus your intelligence, wisdom, or charisma modifier, whichever is highest. Non-witches, remember it works differently whether you're a witch or not. Non-witches, this is how it works. They can target a creature with the same blood hex at most once every 24 hours, whether it's affected by the blood hex or not. You can use a number of blood hexes per day equal to the number of blood hex feats you have, plus 1 additional use per day at 4th level and every 4 character levels thereafter. You can use the same blood hex multiple times as long as you don't exceed your total use of blood hexes for the day. So remember that witches didn't have a limit on the number of times they could use a hex, just the number of times they can affect a single target. Non-witches have that restriction, but they also have a limited number of uses of blood hexes at all per day. And critically, the number is significantly related to the number of blood hex feats they take. Thus, very few uses at all. I mean, you could use one, have it fail, now that target is immune for the rest of the day, and you used a use of your blood hex feature. So now you need to, hope it hits, you have to find a new target, and you have to still have uses, and then try to get it to succeed. And you can't do any of that unless you have damaged the target. Remember that pin from before, recently. Again, we'll get into it in a minute. Now, it's a little better for witches. Witches can take a blood hex feat in place of a regular hex, and sometimes gain additional effects when they use a blood hex, but must still do hit point damage to a creature in order to use the blood hex. A witch can use blood hexes an unlimited number of times per day, but still cannot target the same creature with the same blood hex more than once every 24 hours. All blood hexes with a duration of 1 round can be extended normally using the cackle hex or the chant hex. Don't know what that is yet. So imagine, going back to our example before, that a blood hex requires you to have damaged the creature the same round. Now, maybe we'll get into this more in a minute. It would be kind of baffling if that was part of the design, because that means that hex is almost impossible to use unless you make a very specific build. It's not just much better if you make a build like what we've talked about. It would be nearly impossible to use without making a build expressly for the purpose of being able to use it. Imagine a theoretical blood hex that requires you to damage the creature the same round, but the hex is an action to activate. You then must have a way to deal damage with your movement, bonus action, or reaction, or you literally cannot ever use that feature. Unless, like, maybe it's okay if the witch's ally like holds an action and shoots a crossbow bolt at the right time. Do you have to have damaged them yourself? You have dealt hit point damage to recently. I'm going to say it sounds like you do need to be the one doing the damage. So that doesn't even work. In our example before, we had Hex Strike, which lets you choose a hex you can use to affect no more than one opponent. Let's say we pick a Blood Hex that requires you to damage the target that same round. If you make a successful unarmed strike against an opponent as your action, in addition to dealing your unarmed strike damage, you can use a bonus action to deliver the effects of the chosen hex to that opponent, which would require that you didn't damage them, but you have. So Hex Strike sounds to me like it's good with blood hexes, because it means that if they have a requirement that you did damage recently, you can then fit that into 1 round. You could just punch the enemy in the face and then do the blood hex because you just broke their nose or whatever. You don't have to worry about that requirement as much. It will be interesting to see exactly what you're doing. There's a little clause at the end, EyePatchNotes, you said, this whole sequence you talked about is notable because your Witch of Contradiction build does not use any of these feats or hexes we've talked about, except Cackle. I take it to mean that means you didn't use Hex Strike, which makes me think it's probably the familiar, or like the familiar damaging the enemy counts, or the familiar can deliver the blood hexes, or something like that. Those would be my guesses. But you can see how it's tricky. I mean, this is an example of the game maybe going a little too far on having complexity or flexibility asks like this. It's certainly rewarding to gain these action economy speed-ups, but this is verging on it being necessary to gain these action economy speed-ups. My philosophy as a game designer on this is that it is not good. I think that a key aspect of making a build system fun is that everything in it works if you are not clever. And the benefit of making a well-wrought build in terms of game performance is that you are always merely improving the performance of an aspect of the game, not enabling it entirely. In other words, if blood hexes are literally useless unless you make a build like this, I find paradoxically that for many players that is not that fun. It becomes rote. It simply requires a bunch of other features to even use that part of the game at all. Players in practice may only rarely use blood hexes without doing that stuff, but the ability to use them without doing all that stuff remains important, in my opinion, for fun. It makes the player feel like they have come up with something of their own, or a bit clever. The game designers intend you to do this, but it still gives you the feeling that this is your own creation, and I think that that is important, while simultaneously, kind of a second benefit, allowing you to, use the game piece without heinously enabling it. Sometimes this leads to very organic and backdoor synergies where you just have a little bit of space left on your build. And you can grab a blood hex, let's say, and you realize, my damage over time build where I set enemies on fire and give them COVID-19 at the same time does damage to them every round, I could sneak in a Blood Hex. It turns out that's a weirdly good fit for my build. Because they're not so stringent that you must enable them, they have the opportunity to kind of backdoor their way into builds as well. Now, Blood Hexes, I would imagine, are probably not quite as bad as that theoretical thing I just outlined. I'm sure not all Blood Hexes, by the way it's worded, require you to damage the enemy in the same round. In fact, I bet few or none of them do, because as we've established, that makes them literally actually impossible to use unless you make a very involved build that enables them being usable at all. That doesn't make them good, it just means they are possible to use in gameplay. I would, let's just say hope actually, not assume, that most of them don't work that way. Yeah. At the same time, the idea that they are more expensive to use, you need to enable them a little bit. What's a tight balance, right? At what level of enabling requirements does it become non-functional without a specialized build? Exactly how recently do you need to have damaged an enemy for it to be acceptable as a restriction to the point where you can just take a Blood Hex and use it? Now, I would say not very. I mean, if Blood Hexes require you to have damage the enemy within a round or two, I mean, builds do damage. That's not a particularly strict condition. The question is whether or not you are able to set up the Blood Hex quickly when you want it. For example, a Blood Hex good at the beginning of the fight might end up being pretty bad, even if you only have to have hit the opponent within a round or two, because combat might only last 3 or 4 rounds. Therefore, you can't use it to open the fight. The fight is half over by the time you can enable it. That would make a Blood Hex that asks you to hit the enemy within a round or two. It sounds fine, but that might be surprisingly bad in a lot of tabletop role-playing game tables combat. It's often short. It's said of survey data for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition that combat often lasts an average of 3 rounds. Mine doesn't, but at all, like it really doesn't at all. And to me, that makes me think most people have really grindy types of combat encounters, or a number of combat encounters. The combat encounters themselves are very short and thus rather featureless. Why is there a combat counter there if it's so short? And yet they must have a lot of them. 3 on average to me says, well, boss fights, and then maybe those have like 8. And then what's bringing down that average so much? A bunch of 1 and 2 turn fights. But I'm going to ask those game masters, as a fellow game master, what is the purpose of those fights? Is it fun to use those fights to break up the action, or not so much? If the fight is 1 round and you're letting your players roll dice and pop off a spell, does that need to be a full combat? And maybe they're not running them that way. That could be fun. In any case, tangent aside, it would matter exactly how recently Blood Hexes want you to have inflicted them. The way EyePatchNotes put it, just one more time, is that in order to apply Blood Hexes in 1 turn rather than in 2 turns, arguably making them viable at all, you basically have to engage in alternative or class-specific turn economies. And here's where I think the rub is. Yeah, even if Blood Hexes can be used without this type of economy, it might be that inflicting them rather quickly in 1 round rather than having to do something to set them up, even if that thing is damage you would have wanted to do anyway, and then you inflict the Blood Hex the next round, it might be that's just too long. I mean, in many cases, there's a kind of problem with builds generally in many games where inflicting a debuff is often not viable unless it also does damage. I played a lot of Warlock in World of Warcraft, but this was a long time ago, original vanilla World of Warcraft. Not trying to brag, it was kind of a Wild West situation. About 20 years ago, I played a Warlock, and Warlocks were very much like mages. You throw a fireball, you throw a chunk of ice, you teleport a short distance to get away from the rogue that will kill you every single time, etc. But Warlocks often had spells that did a little less upfront damage, still some, compared to what your mage would do, but they would inflict damage over time. You would cast Immolate and do a minor fire damage hit, still with a casting time, where the mage would have thrown a fireball that did most of its damage up front. But your Immolate would do more damage over time, just you had to wait for some of it. It would be mostly a damage over time thing with a little upfront damage. Thus, these spells still do something if an enemy is low on health or doesn't have much health to begin with, but their primary purpose is to be set up early in the fight and to pay off damage over time. Warlocks had this whole major feature called curses, which were kind of like we've talked about hexes here. The target could only have one at a time, and so they have opportunity cost with each other. You can keep using the same curse on the same target, but they can only have one copy of one curse. So if you want the damage over time one versus the one that makes them slower, well, you have to pick which one, and once you've inflicted one of them, you can't inflict more of that one or the other one without destroying your previous instance. And this became a big feature of the class. But those were only powerful because they were almost all instant. You could cast them immediately while running, potentially on someone you're running away from. Whereas your Immolate, you were committing, obviously it's a live action piece of combat, so it's a bit different, but like you had to cast, you had to spend a few seconds casting. They were viable because they were quick, in other words, curses. And this is what we've done with hexes. By default, they are not any faster than doing an attack. There just are ways you can make them be that fast. And I think EyePatchNotes, your point here, as I take it, is that because they are often mere debuffs and require setup, it's often more or less required for them to be useful that you speed up how quickly you can get them, in the door. I'm going to be interested to see exactly what those things are as we get into it more in Parley. The concept kind of fascinates me. Again, as I outlined it before, I think there's a careful balance where you want things to be useful for something without being enabled, but still significantly better if you build around them. And it's bad both if they don't really have any build hooks, that is, there's not much you can do to improve the thing. That's just fun for players that enjoy that item. And it's also bad if the thing isn't good without those hooks, in my opinion, or useful for something. It doesn't have to be uniquely useful without any build hooks attached, mind you. It could be, it does damage and the damage is fine, but it's like, why would you pick this over 10 other damage options? But you could, and if there was some build hook to hook into it, then great. Now, I think ideally having like 10 whatever damage options isn't ideal, sure, but it's okay if it's like a little redundant if you don't build into it and specialize. It means players can just pick things they want to try, and then if they like something, they can extend it. Lengthen it, as it were. I'm looking forward to the follow-up parlays on this. We've been in this series for a little while, and I have to say, you have convinced me a little bit that this is essentially Dungeons & Dragons from a build-making system perspective, but mostly just better is what I think from a design perspective. I feel like D&D has a lot of weird baggage at this point, and a lot of unnecessarily lacking modularity, I suppose. There is something we've talked about a little in previous Parley that is pinging in my head right now, which is that I kind of like the opportunity cost of multiclassing a little, but it's something that you really need to play the game to experience. I have a lot of complicated feelings about multiclassing. When I played Baldur's Gate 3, I multiclassed very heavily, and a lot of my characters were multiclass of 3 on average, 2 to 4 subclasses and classes. Whereas in my D&D games, or very heavily modified D&D games, up until this point, I had a house rule that you may only multiclass into, like, at most one other class. And I have a complicated reasoning for why I think all of the ways you could do this are good. Limit the multiclassing. Big opportunity cost for multiclassing, but limit it. Don't limit it, but there's still a big cost for it. And have a system like this, where a lot of the loss of multiclassing, that is, you don't go deep to get more feats and deeper class features, seems to have been alleviated in Pathfinder. And so maybe you take a system like that and limit multiclassing a little bit. Whereas limiting multiclassing, but it's really punishing, like it is in 5th edition, I feel like is a little misguided. Like, it's already pretty bad to multiclass a lot of times in 5th edition for various reasons, and except in very specific builds. And so is it entirely necessary to just make the player not do that? And if the reason is that you don't want newer players to make their build bad, you can do what Baldur's Gate does and say at lower difficulty levels you simply can't multiclass. If you're saying you want the game to be easier, the very first thing you should do is not multiclass unless you have an idea you really want to do, and that's what the game does. Like, you could just do that. So I don't know, I'm quickly feeling like the the restricting number of classes to multi-class into thing belongs in a system like Pathfinder if you wanted to do it at all. We'll see. I had a closing comment, which is that in the past, EyePatchNotes, it's often seemed like we disagree about what types of builds we enjoy, but the more I read and perform, create, recite these Parley scripts that you've written, the more I feel like we do enjoy very similar things in making builds, and we were maybe just talking about them differently. An overarching reason why I do Parley for a living, and one which has been very fulfilling, you have done a really good job of fulfilling this thing for me, purely selfishly, is that I want people to genuinely hold different opinions, but I think they often do not. I think we often appear to disagree, but usually actually agree, and it's a misunderstanding. But true disagreement is fun, very interesting. It would be very interesting indeed if lots of people who really understood had had time to explore and mull over and think about their preferences in making builds, really disagreed about what they thought was a fun way to do that, but I don't think there is yet compelling evidence that that is the case. I hope it is. I don't want everybody to truly fully agree. Respect each other's opinions, sure. That should be had relatively easily. All of you do a good job with this, I think. Certainly on the Twitch streams and on this Parley channel. But it would be fun if we really disagreed about what was a fun way to make builds. I just feel like so far, I feel like the more I talk with everybody I've spoken with so far, the more I feel like we actually all like more or less the same things, and it's pretty objective what makes for a good build system. It just seems like we don't feel the same way due to primarily either one, referring to things differently initially, that is like having to meet up our terms, or two, a different amount of exposure to certain kinds of build systems. That is, one of us is going to become sick of a certain type of system, or with enough perspective would come to enjoy in context this other system more, but that just hasn't happened yet. This isn't bad, and I think it often happens from multiple directions. Person A likes this game but will grow tired of it in time. It just doesn't look that way at first. And person B likes this game, but they would like this other game better, they just haven't really seen it yet. And thus person A and B will both eventually prefer game C, which neither of them has played yet, but it appears that they both have very different bents on the subject, when in reality, if we could go back 5 years later, we'd see they're both playing the same exact game, and it isn't either of the games they were playing 5 years earlier. Again, I think we'd be better off if this ended up not being true, but it seems to me so far that, unfortunately, it may be. I feel like when we get into good discussions about what makes for a compelling build system, where there are options, it doesn't feel like there's a whole lot of flexibility in how to make that good from a game design perspective. That is something I've been thinking about a lot in this series, so I wanted to put a little end card about it here. Thanks very much for this Parley. I had a good time. Looking forward to the next one. Folks, if you'd like to get your own Parley like this, you can do that using a link in the description. It'll show you different options you have for where you can pay for it, and some advice from me on how to request something if you want to, but you're just not sure how to put it to words. I got your back. Looking forward to the next one.